Okay, I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about some of these early season insects that we have in our small grains. Okay, there were various and sundry insect pests that attack the small grains, and several of them come in early in the season, and we have to worry about them. There are some aphids that either damage the wheat directly or that spread diseases, that spread some various viruses. And there's also an insect called the Hessian fly that can attack the wheat early on. Fall armyworm we were very concerned about last year, 2016, because it had been so dry. It's a real dry season pest. We were concerned about wheat that was planted as a cover crop or planted overseeded into pastures and hay fields, or even directly planted. If it had been planted early, we were concerned about attack by fall armyworm, but because we've had enough rain, I think that's not going to be as big a concern. So I'm going to focus on the green bugs and the Hessian flies this year. Now, aphids and Hessian fly have multiple generations per year. And the thing to remember about them is that the warmer it is, the faster that these wheat pests are going to grow. That's because these insects are cold-blooded. They're dependent on the temperature of their environment to develop. And each species has got its own lower developmental threshold below which it doesn't develop. So with aphids, somewhere in the 40s, and for example, something like a fall armyworm, it's about, I think, about 48 degrees. So each insects kind of have a different temperature. But the earlier that you plant, you're going to have greater risk from Hessian fly, aphids, and in a dry year, fall armyworms, because the earlier you plant, the more warm weather you have in the fall. So logic would say then, if you plant early, you have lots of bugs. Why don't you just plant late? Well, the problem with that is if you plant later than your recommended planting date, you're going to lower your yield potential drastically. The grafts drop off very badly if you plant later than the recommended dates. So my advice is plant during the recommended planting dates, and that's going to be not too early or not too late, and that's going to maximize your yield potential. And you still may have some problems with these early season pests, but not as many as you would if you planted earlier than your recommended planting date. So here's the dates. It depends on what the purpose of the grain, when you go ahead and plant. And we've got it divided up into North Alabama, Central Alabama, and South Alabama. So let's just look at the top line and think about the grain crops. If we're planted just for grain in Central Alabama, where I'm talking from, that recommended planting date would be October 15th to November 15th. But you can see in South Alabama, that date would be November 15th to December 1st. North Alabama, October 15th to November 10th. Now, as you go down the line there, you'll see that those planting dates get earlier. So the earliest dates are the ones that we have for wildlife planting and for cover crops, or if we're trying to get forages. So these are earlier planting dates, and so you could potentially have a higher risk of damage from Hessian fly and aphids on those than you would on the ones that are just being planted strictly for grain. There's a lot of information. If you go to alabamacrops.com and click on the IPM section, you'll find this IPM guide, IPM 0458 on small grains, insect disease, and weed control recommendations. So I encourage you to check that every year. Recommendations change from year to year, and it's an important place to go and make sure you are always working off the current version of the pest management guide for your crop. This is just a picture showing the burley yellow dwarf virus and cereal yellow dwarf virus causes yellowing symptoms to the grain, and you get a lot of yield loss. You can get a thinner stand if it happens earlier, the stunted plants, and the overall effect is lower yield. But the main symptom that you see is often a yellowing or reddening of the leaves. These viruses are spread by an insect called an aphid that brings the virus in. They fly into the field, and then they, in their wingless form, they spread the viruses through the field. So as I mentioned, sometimes aphids have wings. You can see in this picture on this little seedling here, you've got a lot of aphids with wings that have landed on that. They're the ones that are bringing the virus into the field. And then in their wingless form, they're traveling on foot, but they're radiating out from where the first winged aphids landed, and they can spread the virus that way. There are different kinds of aphids that we have. That spread burly yellow dwarf and cereal yellow dwarf virus. We think the most important ones are the bird cherry oat aphid, that's the one up in the top left. The rice root aphid down there in the bottom is also very capable of spreading it. It often feeds below ground, and says we know a lot less about that one than the others. Corn leaf aphid is also capable of spreading the virus, as is English grain aphid. The thing to remember about your burly yellow dwarf and cereal yellow dwarf when you're trying to manage it is that the earlier the wheat is infected with the virus, the greater the yield loss you're going to have. Aphids are hard to scout for. They are often on the undersides of the leaves. They might move down into the base of the plant like you see in this bottom picture here, or even below ground. So it's hard to know exactly what you've got out there with aphids. And Hessian flies is also something to think about, is that these Hessian flies, when we move on and talk about them, we're going to find that they are protected in the plant for most of their life, so that it's going to be hard to control them with the insecticides. So both these pests are kind of hard to scout for, and with Hessian flies, they're going to be hard to control with insecticides. Aphids, on the other hand, we can control them with an insecticide. So this slide just sort of shows you some of the risk factors that are going to increase the chances of problems that we have. Early planting increases the risk for both. The La Nina phase that Brenda just talked about, going to have a higher risk from both, because that gives you some warmer, drier temperatures, and those are good for the insects to grow. Hessian fly, you see, has got some additional risk factors. Planting wheat after wheat, planting near a wheat field a field that was in wheat the previous spring, volunteer wheat, and how close it is to a wildlife planting that has been planted early with wheat. All these places allow the buildup of the Hessian fly or provide reservoirs of infestation. Now, so the recommendation is to control aphids if yield matters, and you're planting your small grains before the recommended planting date for grain. And we recommend using an aphid rate of a seed treatment, of an insecticide seed treatment, or applying a foliar spray of a pyrethroid insecticide 30 days after planting. So this is if you're planting these things early and you're worried about yield, as opposed to just planting this for a cover crop where you're just trying to hold the soil. There are a lot of active ingredients out there that you can choose from. You'll see there's a bunch of different seed treatments there, and the aphid rates are listed. There are also a bunch of foliar insecticides. The pyrethroids that are ending in thrin are most commonly used to control the aphids. Now, if you're planting the small grains during your recommended date for grains, this is when you're going to be most likely to get a return from your investment. So in North Alabama, we think a seed treatment or a foliar spray 30 days after planting is going to be the most likely to pay off. If you're in South Alabama, you're better off, if you're going to control aphids, to do it in late January, early February, when you're applying that, about the time you're applying your fertilizer, when the crop is starting to green up and grow. Central Alabama, studies show that it's hard to predict when the best time is going to be. You may want to try to rely a little bit more on scouting, as imperfect as it may be, and you might get your highest payoff if you can afford it by treating 30 days after planting, using a seed treatment, as well as checking to see if you've got aphids in late January and February, and spraying then if you do. Now, if you're planting your small grains after your recommended planting date, that means you're not going to have much infestation or growth or spread going on in the fall. So the thing to do under all those conditions is just to wait and put your aphid spray on in late January or early February, about that time when the things are greening up. We already saw that slide. So let's talk a little bit about this Hessian fly. I've already alluded to the fact that it's got multiple generations per year. It infests wheat, barley, triticale, and to a lesser extent, rye. Down in the lower corner is the little adult fly, which looks like a small mosquito. It lays its eggs, you see in that other on the bottom picture, lays the eggs on the leaves. These eggs hatch out and the larvae make their way down to the base of the particular leaf. So these adults are laying their eggs on the most recently expanded leaf, and then after they hatch, the little maggots wriggle their way down as far as they can go till they get to the node, or in a small plant, get down to the base of the plant, and that's where they sit there and feed. So this is almost a fully grown maggot here. When they're smaller, they just look sort of plain white or plain or mostly white with a green stripe running down them. So we call them green guts just because of the way they look. Then they are going to go and they're going to spin this little, what they call this puparium. They'll pupate in there and they'll change from the maggot stage back to the adult stage. So the number of times it does this depends on the temperatures in the winter. So in a La Nina year, you have time for an extra generation as opposed to an El Nino year. So anyway, but just remember it has these multiple life cycle. What does Hessian fly do to the plant? Well, the feeding by these maggots, the saliva causes the plants to react badly. You get stunted plants, you get plants that die, plants that their growth just does not look right. So in this case, you can see this on the left here, you've got this plant that looks like the leaf blade is coming right out of the ground, as opposed to here when it's more normally emerging. So you can actually see the leaf sheath down here on this plant, but not on this one. It's also severely stunted, as you can see down here on this plant on the right. So big problems that we can have if we, with these Hessian flies, and the earlier we infest with these, same thing as with the aphids, with getting that barley yellow dwarf and cereal yellow dwarf virus. The earlier you're infested with Hessian fly, the greater the chance of yield potential and plant death. So one of the symptoms, here's west of central Alabama, which seems to be quite prone to getting Hessian fly problems. You can see how thin the stand is. Many of the plants that were here have been, the original plants have died from Hessian fly infestation. Here you can see the messed up growth. You can see that there's only a few plants in this particular variety that is headed out. The rest are all stunted. The plants are all stunted and riddled with Hessian fly. How are we going to manage Hessian fly? Got to think about that life cycle, and I alluded to all those risk factors. And they're all kind of related to the life cycle of the Hessian fly, and you just have to know that the Hessian fly is going to over summer in that pupal stage that I showed you. It's going to be in the crop stubble and the top little layer of soil and debris in that previous crop field. So if you come in and plant wheat after double crop wheat, soybean, wheat, soybean, wheat, soybean, you can see that's a real high risk situation. Or if you're planting your wheat right next to the field that was in wheat the previous year, it's all because of it's a higher risk because of the fact that those Hessian flies are hanging out right there in that. They could be in the wildlife plots. They could be spending their summer in those where those wildlife plots were, or where some cover crops were. So in late summer and early fall, these adults of flies are going to emerge, mate, and lay eggs either on early planted small grains or on volunteer wheat. And Hessian fly can infest your small grains as early as that first leaf stage. So our IPM recommendations, there's no one magic bullet for Hessian fly. It's a matter of applying a bunch of these management tactics. So we're going to want to avoid continuous planting of wheat in the same field if we can. want to select a Hessian fly resistant variety, particularly if some of our other risk factors are high. It's going to be important to pick a Hessian fly resistant variety. Control that volunteer wheat because that's involved with that early season buildup. Don't plant your wheat early. Plant rye, oats, or a Hessian fly resistant wheat for grazing or for your wildlife planting rather than a susceptible wheat. If it's possible, use a moldboard plow and bury that wheat debris right after harvest. That will kill a bunch of the pupae. I know that's not compatible with a lot of our cropping systems these days, but entomologists love tillage. As I mentioned, don't use your susceptible wheat for wildlife planting. That can build up Hessian flies for an entire area. Now, if you're going to grow a susceptible variety, particularly if you've got some other risk factors, consider using a high rate of those insecticide seed treatments. And you can find all those listed in the IPM guide. The aphid rate won't cut it. You have to see that you will have to use a higher rate. Sometimes that involves some additional treatment of the seed other than what comes with some extra active ingredient to bump that rate up. Or consider spraying a foliar pyrethroid insecticide at the 2-leaf stage. So that's earlier than the 30 days after planting we talk about for aphids. 2-leaf, it's just when it's just getting rolling because you were trying to protect that because that early season infection is the most devastating. Now, I alluded to resistant varieties. As Jake starts out his wheat variety webinar, which will be posted shortly, I heard him say it's a moving target. It's trying to pick the best variety because of all the different factors you got to think about. You got to think about yield potential. You got to think about disease resistance. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on. And our Hessian flies are kind of continuously evolving as an arms race as you build resistance into the wheat, and then the Hessian flies learn how to overcome it, and then we got to put in new genes for a different resistant gene into the wheat, and then the Hessian flies figure that out. This is our current guesstimate of what some of the best varieties might be in terms of Hessian fly resistance for Alabama. If you go down, we do have a website on Hessian fly, and we try to maintain the most current information there. Different data from different states, you kind of see just how these things perform. So these are what we think are some of the good varieties. I'm not going to list them all out here. These are the ones that we think are susceptible, or we're pretty sure are susceptible. Now, a lot of these on this page are some of our more commonly grown high yield potential varieties. I'm not saying don't grow those. I'm saying if you do grow those, be aware that there is a risk for Hessian fly, and make sure you're working on minimizing some of those other risk factors so that you might get away with growing a susceptible variety. A lot of the ones that we saw this year where we had problems in spring 2017, we're in Jamestown. This was an interesting year because people were not able to plant early in fall 2016. A lot of our wheat got planted in December, but then La Nina kicked in. It was warm. We had time for some buildup in the late winter for Hessian fly. They had a pretty good year, and the variety was widely planted in Alabama. I think last year was Jamestown, and the fields that had economic damage were that particular variety. It is very susceptible to Hessian fly. But anyway, all of these on this list, you just got to know that you're at risk for Hessian fly if you go with those. Now, for more information, last year I did a longer version of this webinar. If you go to the alabamacrops.com and click on the webinar section in the 2016 webinars, you will see it. There's also, you can just go to that link right there, or a QR code will take you right to that longer version of the talk. I always want to point out there is extra information about these. If you go to their ACES, Alabama Cooperative Extension System website, aces.edu, and look for these publications. That provides you with more information. You got to think about producing your wheat. A couple of good resources are listed right there. And then it's always important to think about cover crops and things. Here's a couple of good resources on cover crops as well, because I know a lot of wheat is grown as a cover crop. So I think, oh yeah, and wildlife plantings, we have information about wildlife planting as well. Here are some good links for that. All right. Anybody have any questions?